Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are in day 2 of our committee meeting, 30th meeting of the Committee on Sustainable Energy. We will still continue this morning under agenda item 6, which is in this morning's session dedicated to the issue of subsidies and carbon pricing. The reference for this is the 69th session of the Economic Commission for Europe, which has requested the committee to explore the impact of subsidies, including options for carbon pricing. So this is the mandate to deal with this issue. Before I start into the session, please allow me to try at least some clarifications, as there were in the meantime questions regarding the jurisdiction of this committee. Also the mandate was given by the Commission, and therefore I would like to explain before we enter into the discussions at a later stage this morning. This instrument, so subsidies as well as carbon pricing, are an instrument to trigger the decarbonization. If you refer especially to the fossil related subsidies. And this is nothing else than the opposite hand of a regulatory instrument, as for example, we discussed in the context yesterday of an efficiency in buildings. We are also talking about standard setting, which is also an instrument. The one is regulatory one, the others are economic instruments. But as we can see it primarily here in this committee related to energy and climate issues, we have, of course, a very high relevance of this subsidy topic and carbon pricing topic under macroeconomic considerations. And this was one of the questions, if this is up to another committee. I think it's definitely the point that subsidy issues and carbon pricing issues are macroeconomic important elements and relevant in a discussion, not only for this committee, but for me it seems a little bit as an artificial distinction, as if these instruments and subsidies and carbon pricing are perceived to have a high macroeconomic relevance. They are also automatically linked to the issues of energy security and access to energy. As you can say that subsidies in parts of our region are meaning a very high cost factor for the society. You can see this reflected in the state budgets. And on the other hand, given the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement, you can assume that there will be a price increase for carbon increasingly, which then once again could affect energy security as well as a question of access to energy, having in mind the social poor. So it's important to see the role of subsidies and of carbon pricing in the financing of the transition. Carbon pricing can send as its opposite, as a negative carbon price is a subsidy, at least a fossil subsidy, send a signal into the economies for investors as well as to consumers. And you could see this also this week when the EU Commission indicated under the new package for climate policy to introduce this carbon border adjustment from the year 26 onwards, which already sends now a clear signal into the community, to the business sector, at least for the sectors of cement industry and steel industry, two of the examples, that there will be an increased cost factor when it comes to trading. So it's an early warning system, so to say, taking up a word from our pathways discussion, that there will be additional costs coming with this carbon pricing and with the decarbonization processes. And therefore, that was a consideration here when we proposed it to the Commission to include this under our activity areas to deal with this issue at an early stage. Another element is that it allows for better allocation of the resources. As we are all aware that this transition and the decarbonization process is an extremely expensive exercise. And therefore it's important to address with policy activities the most efficient areas. So that on the other side does not mean that subsidies, that there's no rule for subsidies. Of course, there is a rule for subsidies, and therefore the discussion, I just to try to come back to the original discussion why we proposed this to deal with this issue. There is a rule, for example, for protecting the social poor. So if we increase prices for special forms of energy, or for energy in total, then it can have negative social impacts, and therefore the compensation for those groups is an important issue. As if this is not addressed, then the political feasibility to introduce an ambitious climate policy or decarbonization policy cannot be achieved. The other point is also very relevant, and one of the major activity fields in our work from the committee, that that subsidies also are an important instrument for the structural change of regions heavily dependent on fossil fuels in the past. So we have so-called mono cities, we have mono regions, and of course, to get the acceptance for change, it will be necessary to support such regions and the people living there, as otherwise there might be no support for respective approaches. And at the end, that's a technology field. We are also discussing under the pathways for the implementation of new technologies is at least for some time necessary to support the implementation of such inventions. Hydrogen might be such an example. So what I wanted to say is that the transition and especially the decarbonization needs that we see the full picture so that we can choose the most efficient instruments, among them regulatory instruments as well as economic instruments. And in this broader picture, we can see the discussion on carbon pricing and on subsidies. Insofar, I very much appreciate that we have this opportunity to discuss this morning, and that we have two experts this morning in our session, who have dealt for quite a long time in the respective area. And I would like to mention that especially the OECD, who is working in that area, especially also in the eastern part, is working for quite a very long time, is very much experienced in this regard. We have Nelly Petkova from the OECD office in Paris. And we have Ron Steenblick, who has also worked for quite a long time with the International Energy Agency and the OECD, and now is working for the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And I would like first to give Ron the floor for his introductory presentation. Thank you very much.
Could you unmute Ron, please?
Yes, I tried, but it said that I wasn't allowed to.
You are now on.
Okay. Yes, good morning, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you at your meeting, albeit virtually. I was asked to just give a brief introduction to how one might approach the question of quantifying subsidies to energy. And I only have a couple of slides, and then I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. So if you could show the next slide. Okay, so I thought by starting with the basic questions that one might ask when identifying, quantifying subsidies. And so there are lots of dimensions to it in terms of what you're going to measure and the scope and so forth. And one is which parts of the value chain. So for example, years ago when I was working at the International Energy Agency, we quantified only subsidies to the production of coal. But particularly if you're looking at natural gas or oil or even coal, there's often subsidies to transport. And then the IEA, for example, looks at subsidies to electricity, which is essentially a transformation of coal and natural gas these days. And then, do you want to look at consumption? And where do you draw the boundaries between each of these areas? So that's one question one has to ask. The unit of analysis. Most intergovernmental organizations, when they start approaching this, and NGOs, they'll look at a country. But a lot of the work recently at the OECD on other sectors outside of energy, like say aluminium, semiconductors and so forth, have actually started to look at subsidies to specific firms. And from that level, that could be very interesting for companies that are multinational, because oftentimes they're receiving subsidies from different places. If one is looking at the national level, should one also look into the subnational? So in a country like Australia, in the United States, it's the state level. In Canada, the provinces. In Germany, the land. Actually in a number of countries for fossil fuel subsidies anyway, and I suspect that would be the case for most other kinds of energy, they're often quite significant, the subnational measures. So if you're not looking at the subnational measures, then you're missing a big part of the picture. But of course, that also adds to the work. And in a country like the United States, you have 50 states. The baseline. So there's several kinds of baselines. So for example, if you're looking at tax expenditures, so the value of targeted tax breaks to an industry, usually the government will have its own defined normal tax system. And then when they measure tax expenditures, they're measuring deviations from that or exceptions from that tax system. But also, if you're looking at, for example, regulated prices, should you look at the market prices in that year, or decide on some kind of fixed period and look at how the prices in the country you're looking at have changed relative to this fixed year. The only reason I mention that is at the WTO, for example, countries report their subsidies to agriculture, and that it's called the aggregate measure of support, and they decided to fix a particular period, 1987 to 1980. maybe 1986 to 1989, I believe, or 1987 to 1989, and then do it against that. But there are particular reasons why they look back that far. So then the other things are how you organize the information or how you start looking for things. And if you look at, for example, the WTO agreement on subsidies, it's really described, its definition is in terms of transfer mechanisms. That's what we at the OECD called transfer mechanisms. So how are the subsidies provided? Is it through a grant? Is it through subsidies in kind? So actually providing things free from the government, or is it through indirect measures like price regulation or export tariffs or import tariffs? Then equally important, particularly for analysis, is the incidence. And what that means is, so the statutory incidence. So there's a difference between the statutory incidence, that is, how are the, what aspect of the firm are you subsidizing? Are you subsidizing the actual produced product, or are you subsidizing the inputs to making that product, for example? Now, that's called statutory incidence because there's a difference between that and ultimate incidence, which is where the actual money ends up, who benefits. So for example, you could have subsidies that go to consumers, but because of the way that the market is structured, it ends up actually in the pockets of the producers. And then finally, once you've decided how you're going to organize the information, what sources do you look at? And so at the OECD and most non-governmental organizations, when they look at subsidies, they turn to the governments and public documents. But in the IEA, for example, a lot of their information comes from proprietary sources. The proprietary sources can be excellent sources of data, but usually, because they're proprietary, you cannot document your sources. So it's a black box in terms of if anybody wants to try to replicate the information. Okay, next slide. So I talked about the value chain. This is a very nice illustration that was done by a couple of people a few years ago at the Overseas Development Institute. And you would have a supply chain or value chain for every industry. This is showing fossil fuel subsidies. So starting with exploration, then extraction, and then in some cases preparation, transport, further processing, distribution, and consumption. So if you might want to say, well, when we talk about production, we're talking about all the way through to processing, or you might just restrict it to the exploration and extraction part. Next slide. So you have that data decided. You've decided what parts of the value chain you want to look at. Then you have the question of the transfer mechanisms you want to count, and where you'll be looking at in terms of the type, what parts of the firms or final consumers are targeted. So you see, this is a matrix that's been used now to illustrate these ideas by the OECD since about 2011. Transfer mechanism on the left, and then the columns are the statutory incidents. So you can see examples. The traditional idea of a subsidy is a direct transfer of funds. The government just pays a check, or not usually cash these days, or does a wire transfer to the firm. The traditional subsidy was actually, we will pay you a certain amount for every ton produced. A ton of coal, for example, and years ago in Western Europe, there were these kinds of payments. Or it might, at the end of the year, they say, well, okay, show us how much you paid, how much you receive for it, and then we'll make up the difference between the market price and your actual cost. Other subsidies, target price and enterprise income, they'll say, well, you know, particularly for, like, say, quasi-state firm, if they make a loss, then the government will make up the loss, and that might cover a whole bunch of different products that they produce. So, I mean, I won't go on to discuss each of these cells here, but we've found this a useful way for people to find where particular subsidy that they've seen, where it fits into the grand scheme of the way it's provided, and to what point or what part of the activity of the firm is it providing, or in the final column on the right hand side, consumption. So I'll stop there, but like I said, I'll stay on, and so if there are questions afterwards, I'm happy to discuss. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ron. I think that's good indications why subsidies mean costs, and that we have to take them into account in the process for the transition, just for efficiency reasons, if these costs seems to be justified, or if there are better ways how to do the allocation. I then would like to continue with Nelly Petkova from the OECD.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Jürgen. Good morning, Ron. Thank you, Ron, very much for this very good and nice introduction, which helps my presentation. I've been asked actually to talk about our work on fossil fuel subsidies in the EU Eastern Partnership countries. We've been doing this work for the last several years, and I believe that now we have a pretty good understanding of what the overall picture is, and how subsidizing producers and consumers of fossil fuels has been involved between about 2010 and 2019, which is the last year that we were looking at. Next slide, please. As I said, the focus of our work has been on the 6 countries of the Eastern Partnership region, which are, as all of you would know, I guess, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And the scope of the studies that we've done, as Ron, I believe, was saying already, we focus on looking at government support that goes to both producers and consumers of coal, oil, and different petroleum products, particularly used, as you can imagine, in the transport sector, natural gas, which is a very important source of energy in the region, and also electricity and heat, which are generated and produced by using different fossil fuels. One important thing which I want to say is you all saw this very nice metrics which OECD has developed over the years, and you see that there are very different mechanisms for transferring the subsidies to producers and consumers of fossil fuels. But in doing our analysis, we follow also the mainstream OECD work and methodologies for identifying and measuring subsidies. And we basically focus on 2 main categories. These are direct budget transfers and tax expenditures and other revenue foregone by the state. I just wanted to say that, as also many of you know, identifying and measuring probably the easiest and most straightforward type of subsidy, as you can go and find numbers in different in the law budget, for example, for a given year, or different documents prepared by the parliament on the execution of the budget programs. And it's relatively easy and straightforward. This is not exactly the case with the tax expenditure, as Ron was explaining. They are not really ready-made. We don't have easy numbers to look at. We have to estimate the expenditure or the revenue foregone by the state budget, because of different tax breaks provided usually through the tax code. And most of the countries, particularly in our region, do not produce regular annual, let's say, tax expenditure reports where this information is gathered, where estimates are prepared and reported to the government, to the public at large, which makes things a little bit more difficult to deal with. Next slide, please. I just want to give you an idea what happens in the region over the last 4 years with the last study that we did on fossil fuel subsidies. And as you can see, there is a huge difference between the countries. And obviously this depends on the size of the country, depends on the size of the economy, but most importantly on the, I would say, on the structure of the economy. And you have, I would say, maybe 3 groups of countries. If you look at this slide, you can see that, for example, in general, subsidies, I would say they range between 5 million in 2019 in Armenia to more than 2 billion in Ukraine. And Ukraine, par excellence, is the country which has the largest size of fossil fuel subsidies among the 6 countries. But you have Armenia and Georgia, where subsidies on an annual basis go between 5 and 15 million per year. Then you have the second group of countries, which are Belarus and Moldova, where we see that they are between 60, 70, 80 million per year. And then, of course, you have Azerbaijan and Ukraine, where subsidies, of course, they fluctuate, but the level goes between 1 million to more than 2 billion in Azerbaijan to 2 billion in Ukraine. So there is a big difference, but what I wanted to say here is that many of you may have heard that OECD and looking at OECD and other non-OECD countries has put in place a very good database on fossil fuel subsidies. And recently, the countries of the EU Eastern Partnership region have been included in the OECD database. So those of you who are interested to get more information about the subsidies, you can go to the OECD database and find this information and data there. Each subsidy scheme, each individual subsidy measure is actually also described in more detail in the database. So talking about transparency, I think, which was one of the issues that you are raising, I think the fact that countries in the region agreed to work with the OECD and be included in the database is already a very important step towards increasing transparency in terms of the state spending on supporting the production and consumption of fossil fuels. Next slide, please. While we are talking about subsidies, the size of subsidies that go to the energy sector and to the fossil fuel production and consumption in particular, in absolute terms, it's also important to look at these numbers in relative terms, particularly relative to as a share of GDP. And again, I think it's not surprise anymore that it's not a surprise that particularly Azerbaijan and Ukraine have the largest share of fossil fuel subsidies as a share of GDP, which goes between 2 and more than 2.3% of GDP. This is a significant share, and it's a significant burden on the state budget, as I think both Ron and Jürgen were saying. But it also shows that you know, in these countries, there is a lot of room for reforming the subsidies and improving, creating more fiscal space and reallocating this both environmentally harmful and economically bad subsidies to more productive sectors, to socially important sectors like health, like maybe even education, but also importantly to supporting clean energy sources rather than supporting fossil fuel production. Next slide, please. In terms of the types of subsidies and how they are channeled, what we see is that most countries actually use direct budget transfers, which is easy at least for the public at large and for the government to identify and to see in their documents and in their budgets, reflected in the budgets. But we have a couple of countries which use tax expenditure as the main mechanism to transfer support to the energy sector. Ukraine, interestingly, Armenia use a number of tax expenditure subsidy measures. And Moldova is of particular interest in among our countries, the countries that we work on, because most of the support goes in the form of tax expenditure. And this is particularly, they reduce and also they eliminate VAT, for example, the value-added tax on the consumption of natural gas, also heat and electricity for consumers. And this gives, as you can imagine, a significant, you know, this translates into a significant burden on the budget because of this uncollected or low collection of revenue from this tax. This is important to know because a lot of people in the countries and particularly in the governments, they do not realize that there is a room of improvement in terms of reforming tax expenditures and in the energy sector, and they do not realize that there are significant losses for the state budget that come from this type of support. Next slide, please. When we talk about who benefits from the subsidies, whether this is producers or consumers, what we see is that basically in most countries it is really consumers that benefit from support from the government. Of course, this is related to the fact that there are a lot of poor people and they need to be supported. One interesting point which I want to make here is that when we talk to colleagues in the governments in these countries about fossil fuel subsidies, about reforming fossil fuel subsidies, there people basically think about subsidies as social tariffs. They do not see them really as economically inefficient instrument, but rather they believe this is an instrument which helps support the poor segments of society. And one thing which we've seen over the years is that indeed this blanket type of subsidies to consumers which existed years ago in many of the countries have been significantly reformed. Ukraine is one very good example of this, where they have moved from untargeted to really targeted subsidies which are provided to specific low-income households, where they really identified households against specific criteria, so that rich households do not continue to benefit from government support. Next slide, please. And in the context of Ukraine, we started recently another analysis, particularly working with Ukraine. And I just wanted to show you the evolution of subsidies over the years between 2010 and 2020, with some initial information on 2021. The gray bar basically shows fossil fuel subsidies over the years. And as you can see, 2019 and 2020, the amount of subsidies has been significantly reduced. There is a significant decline. One good news is that support for renewables has significantly increased, which is really something which picked up, a trend which picked up very recently, particularly with the COVID, after COVID hit us all. But also targeted subsidies, as I was saying, in Ukraine, over the years, starting 2016, when the first significant reforms in the sector were introduced, they have been increasing generally, although these last years, 2019, 2020, they have also, we see a decline. And one of the reasons is that the system for targeted support to poorer and vulnerable households has been improved, and the country has, and the state, the governments have been thinking how to do it better so that they really identify those who are in need. I will, one last slide I want to show you. Please, next slide. Just wanted to say that what we've seen generally over the years is, of course, there are fluctuations in the size of government support that goes to fossil fuel producers and consumers, but countries, a number of countries, among which Armenia, Belarus, Ukraine in particular, we've seen significant efforts to reduce subsidies, to introduce, as I said, targeted support for poor households, and to rethink the need for specific schemes that can benefit particularly producers, I would say, in the countries. I will stop here, and I just want to say that we continue work in the countries, specific countries in the region. We are planning to do more work with Ukraine, as I said, on countries, on issues related to regulated energy prices, which is a major issue in Ukraine, particularly in the gas sector, as you can imagine, with Moldova on tax expenditure. With Armenia, we are working right now. We started working with the Armenian government on supporting them to prepare their first official fossil fuel report under the SDG reporting format, which is something new, as many of you would know. So as OECD, we are planning, just wanted to say, we are planning more work in this area together with the countries and the governments in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelly. So I also would like to take the opportunity to show the links between the committees here under the UNECE. Just was Nelly in her presentation had for the Eastern Partnership countries is what can partly seen as activity under the Environment for Europe process, which is here under the Committee for Environmental Politics, and therefore we try to link work programs and activities here under the UNECE scheme. And I think this is a good point to show how there's an interaction. Both panelists in their presentations highlighted the transparency issue. So the transparency on subsidies is of crucial importance as long as you do not really know what the subsidies are, it's difficult to address changes. And the second point is that the structure of the subsidies is a very important issue, especially regarding the energy and climate agenda. So we have this mix of more energy targeted subsidies, and on the other side, more socially motivated subsidies. And this is mixed up, and this can end in an efficient use of resources, especially when it comes to the development of the energy system. And I think this is one of the most relevant points which can be addressed in our work, as this is a barrier, as said at the beginning, in the transition process. As you could see this morning, we have only 2 out of 4 panelists. So there's the gap in the program, frankly speaking. As we said, we would address in this session the subsidy issue as well as the carbon pricing issue. So the carbon pricing issue is not covered by our panelists this morning. So I cannot compensate for this, but I could try, but that's not my function here. But at least not to leave this gap completely. I only would like to make a few remarks regarding the carbon pricing, as this topic is more or less reflected in many areas of our work program. So indirectly, it was already mentioned that the subsidies are a form of a negative carbon price. And you can see immediately under the Paris Agreement and the Agenda 2030, that this is contradictory to the intentions of Paris Agreement and the 2030 agenda. So a point to be dealt with. The other point is that carbon pricing is reflected in taxes, in emission trading systems, but also already reflected in this decision mechanism of companies and also the banks. For example, for some time, the international financing institutions, they are working with shadow prices for carbon. So I do not know the exact figure at the moment, but for 2 years ago, I heard that the Asian Development Bank, for example, have a carbon price in their calculations evaluating investment proposals of $35 per ton CO2. And this is more or less implemented now by all international financing institutions, I think with an increasing amount for the carbon price. So talking about financing of the transition and the implementation of new technologies, we should have this in mind. As at another place in our agenda and in the work programs, we have these investment guidelines as a topic, and there's a clear reference to the respective point. Another example also for shadow pricing might be the implementation of carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and use. We do know that for some countries in the area, they can already afford to do carbon capture and storage with prices of around about $30 per ton CO2, and others maybe with 80. So you can directly see that on the competitiveness aspects, carbon capture and storage will not take place if the carbon price in the market is less than this 30 or this 80. So talking about the relevance of carbon capture and storage in our works is therefore directly linked to such price considerations. I made this other example in the beginning with this introduction of this carbon border adjustment of the EU, or the intention to implement this. So in the EU, in the emission trading system, we have at the moment a market price around about 50 euro per ton CO2. And this might be the reference case, at least when it comes to competition issues in steel, where you can see this not as an exact price at the moment, but at least to give an indication for the future, what might be a relevant price. That does not automatically mean that we have a global or European-wide carbon price, but in the internal considerations of banks and of companies, this of course will play a role. Another point is China now introducing emission trading systems, and other countries as well. Of course, they have in mind to link this so that there's no distortion between the countries when it comes to competition. Other point, you referred to the COP26, and one of the main agenda items in the COP26 this year will be the a mechanism, so-called Article 6, which would allow that countries can implement partly their obligations under the climate policy in other countries. And of course, they will do this on the basis of reference prices, shadow prices, if they are regularly established or not. This does not play an important role at this stage, but it clearly shows the direction it will go. And therefore, as is so relevant in all these areas of our work, technology, then to set appropriate instruments or recommend something which is our task for the countries, how to deal with these aspects. This is a point which is interesting and relevant. As for the practical implementation of politics, even if such prices are not formally implemented, we should have them in mind to give the appropriate recommendations. So please excuse that I tried to fill the gap at least with some considerations in this regard. And I then would like to open the floor for questions and as well as for further contributions under this agenda item or discussion before we end up with this session on subsidies and the carbon prices. Please, Russian Federation.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to put on the Chippendale hat and help you with filling the gap, because you expected 4 panelists. Well, we have already 3 speakers. I'll be the 4th one here. I'll touch upon several things here. First of all, the general debate going under this commission and basically under the UN. You probably know that we've been quite reluctant with including the subsidies issue in the scope of view of this specific committee. Though, I mean, it's a discussion platform. Why not? Let's try and have some discussion. With the main reason being that you can't argue the fact that subsidies are a national measure taking under the regular economic planning of the specific state. And both yourself and Executive Secretary yesterday highlighted that basically the achieving carbon neutrality in accordance with the Paris Agreement is supposed to be going in accordance with the national programs and under national circumstances. So basically, as long as we commit to implementing the overall goals set by the Paris Agreement, you can read it as basically we are free to choose the path how we're going to achieve this. And basically, that's why we see subsidies as a specifically national measure. And we really appreciate the expertise provided by the UN and other agencies on that matter. And we are really open to advice in this. And but again, When I was like looking at the program today, I was expecting like there are supposed to be 2 panelists. And I was basically, since we are addressing the subsidies, would expect one of the speakers to address the issue of subsidies in the fossil fuel industry, and the other speaker addressing the subsidies in the renewables. Well, I haven't heard the second one. And comparing the figures, all the slides which I've seen today for the fossil fuel subsidies, all the figures that I've seen, they were counted in millions. And may I remind that my distinguished colleague from the United States yesterday speaking, he was sort of giving some information on the amount of funds invested in only research and development. It's not only supporting the whole renewables, only research and development. Those were, if I'm correctly remembering, 400 billions. And you won't be a fortune teller to predict that in 5 years, like all the national measures taken in support of the fossil fuel industry, though they would look like, I don't know, a kindergarten sandbox comparing to all the measures taken in support of the renewables. You were rightfully saying that those, like the motivation for such measures can be absolutely different. It can be the preference regime for specific players on the market, or those could be social protection, like socially support schemes, which are also should be in place because it's like a part of the social policy of the state. And again, I would argue that it's up to the states to define how to plan those policies. And basically, we've seen today the case examples from 5 countries, which I would again argue would be classic like technical assistance, but I so far haven't heard anyone from those countries speaking on those numbers. Though, well, we all know that technical assistance, first of all, should be provided upon request, but it's a different, again, thing here. So also like addressing the issue of, I mean, since I probably be the only speaker today addressing the issue of subsidies and support for the renewables, we're also like not lagging behind here. I mean, we do have a number of projects in the Russian Federation which we basically try to support the production of renewables, and the number of investments, as I get the figures, like for the last 7 years, they amount to $10 billion. And again, those would be at least comparable to the support measures provided for the fossil fuels. So first point I would like to make is when we address the subsidies, if we are going to do it in the future, we would highly suggest to address all the subsidies in the energy sector, not like taking out specifically one sphere, and especially not making judgments whether it's good or bad, because you don't know. I mean, you can make such judgment only seeing the generalist figure and picture here, and I would really, well, be cautious of making like general judgments here, because again, like the discussion is going on, and as long as we address fossil fuel subsidies, the context where it's placed, it's mostly the negatives in like 99% of the presentations and observations. But again, well, if we address like our country and our specific, like the Russian case, the lion's share of subsidies in the fossil fuel, which we're now undertaking, they go to support the production, which is specifically counts the environmental factor. So should we stop those subsidies? I mean, I don't think that's the intention, because if we make an assessment that the fossil fuel subsidies are bad, then, well, we are supposed to end up those programs, but they are specifically designed to make sure that the greenhouse gas emission from the sector is going down. So again, like the only thing why we were and we are reluctant to address this under this specific committee is that this issue is, first, it's quite sensitive, and second, it's really complicated. And the idea is rather to address subsidies as such, and that would be the best place for this would be the macroeconomic forums rather than thematic committees. Or if we do it like here in Energy Committee, we should address, I believe, all the subsidies in the energy sector and just throw their like pros and cons. And instead of arguing like which ones are good, which ones are bad, I think the best idea would be just to find the common grounds and see where we can move on with that. But I really, I really evaluate that this would be pretty complicated. And the moment we approach the agreeing on the report, you probably see that I'm right. Also, like, I'm not really a good expert and the right person to address the issue of greenhouse gas pricing and the carbon exchange, so to say, carbon market. And normally, well, what I would do to use my job, I would just say that this issue should rather be addressed in the UNFCCC, because we have brilliant experts here and they could present the brilliant case examples from my country. We just identified the pilot zone, the Sakhalin area, where we would be launching like the first pilot, so to say, project to ensure that the carbon trade is in place and the mechanisms are working. So again, like I would rather not address those issues in conjunction, because those are two different separate tracks from here. So, because I mean, you would rather have a special session on that, and I would also argue it should rather be in a different committee than this one. So, yeah, as you see, this is really quite quite a complicated and substantive issue. So, well, at least we tried discussing it here, because I think it is the first time the committee addresses it. But yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with everyone on the outcome report and see where we're going to land. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Russian Federation. So I fully agree. We should not try to have categories as good and bad. That's definitely right. And we should address all types of subsidies. And I would also fully support to include in such considerations subsidies for renewables and also for other technologies. The focus maybe on the fossils is, as we are discussing this in the context of decarbonization and this carbon neutrality and the Paris Agreement. But of course, you can say if there's a subsidy on renewables, that is partly compensating for the other subsidies. So you have to take the overall pictures. A point which might be critical, of course, this is a very complex issue, but all this decarbonization and transition process is complex. And our task is here to, at least this is my understanding, to address related problems and to develop tools or recommendations how the countries can best deal with these challenges. Of course, it's up to all the countries to make their own decisions on their energy policy as well as on the subsidy schemes and so far, but at least to give some indications which is the direction for the next years and what they can expect. I think this under the main mandate for this committee, energy security, access to energy, and then having in mind, and this is a clear mandate, the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement. We cannot exclude such considerations from our working activities here. But I very much appreciate, it's absolutely clear that we have different opinions, different strategies, and this is a good place, as said yesterday by the Secretary General, and I made this point in my introduction as well. The UNECE is a place where we can discuss this very open and open-ended, and then it's up to the countries to do their decisions. And insofar, I think that's a good opportunity to provide this platform for this not so easy discussions. If you, Scott, I think then, yeah, I think first it was Petros, please, and then followed by the European Union.
Thank you. I would like to agree with you, Mr. Chair, that the carbon prices are related to the CCS issue and the net carbon work that is being done in the division. As I read the 1.5 degree, this is simply saying that there will be no greenhouse gas emissions. And that would be the framework under which all other activities would have to take place. So in the net carbon study, of course, there is a graph that shows how carbon can be, or CO2 in that case, can be stored, and there are costs that vary from some very low costs that projects already implemented to at the far end, and where the costs will stop is the direct air capture and storage. So that price, I think, comes out around $150 a ton, which is much higher than you mentioned, and it may not be right, and I'm sure that those costs can be driven down. But that would be a cost which does not go in as a tax, so to say, in the way that a carbon price below those costs would do, with no effect on emissions. It would be a cost that would go to the capture and storage of the carbon emissions to meet the requirement of no more greenhouse gas emissions. And you would look for locations for this sort of thing in areas where energy is cheap and recipients are good. And you use the atmosphere as the transfer medium for the CO2 that can't be captured elsewhere.
Thank you, Sigrun. Then European Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor, and good morning, dear colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here in person today. And indeed, it has a lot of benefits, and I'm definitely available for also informal discussions on a lot of energy-related topics until the end of the week. And I'm looking forward to finding good compromise proposals. I'm a little bit surprised by this discussion, I have to admit, and also by the questions about the mandate of this committee to start with. First of all, and thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the clarifications earlier this morning. But also, I thought that the mandate comes actually from the Commission, and it also, obviously, the mandate after the Commission is endorsed by ECOSOC. We did agree last year at the 29th session of this committee to continue studying how to address efficient use of energy resources, and is in this regard the impact of subsidies as well as carbon pricing option. I tend to agree with my colleagues and with other delegates that it would have been useful to have more views in this panel. Having said that, we're starting the discussions, and I think we're establishing the knowledge, and we're also establishing the contact with the key players in this area. I do want to weigh in a little bit on the sensitivity of this issue. I agree, it is actually a national issue, but so is the entire energy policy. So in a way, there are many sensitive areas under the Sustainable Energy Committee that are being discussed. We've always approached it in the spirit of cooperation, which is what the UNECE is about. We've always tried to be very pragmatic, because we all know we have our different sensitivities, but we need to cooperate to to work better together, but also to achieve certain targets and objectives that we have set for ourselves at the global scale. And I think this committee has always played quite an important role in trying to achieve our objectives together. within the UNECE region. So mostly European. I don't want to say Europe because we have also non-European members. So I looked also at the strategic review of the Sustainable Energy Subprogram, which we endorsed at least for now yesterday. And we actually have two elements to work on in terms of subsidies and carbon pricing. It's the assessment of energy subsidies and their implications for attainment of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement, and continued study of how to address efficient use of energy resources, and in this regard, the impact of subsidies as well as carbon pricing options. So it would be unfortunate if we had to start renegotiating these agreements that had been endorsed even at the level of ECOSOC. For future, I think it would be interesting to understand why we had, I understand, some last minute cancellations from the speakers and try to avoid it in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Commission. Norway, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for putting this on the agenda. I think with the era we are moving into now, subsidies, carbon pricing is going to be a key issue. We're talking a lot about financing new energy forms, and that would implicitly mean funding subsidies for new energy forms, renewable energy, and so on. So, however, I agree with the Russian Federation. This is very complicated, and I think therefore it's necessary to bring it up so we better understand the implications of what we are doing and preparing the basic platform for decision makers. And let me also add that this is very closely linked to the next item on the agenda, just transition, because energy is a key for all of us, all over the world, and it's a key issue for all the sustainable development goals. If we take away subsidies overall, it's going to be a revolution in many countries. It's a huge issue, and many of these areas, depending on subsidies, are living in very cold climate areas, remote areas. There are few alternatives. The only way people can inhabit these areas is by help from the government. This should also be taken into account. Now, I would like to put forward a few questions on the structure to better understand what we're talking about. We see a lot of charts on fossil fuels. Now, Iran happened to be almost at the top on all these charts. Iran is a huge gas producer, very low cost gas producer, and they have very low gas prices for the people. Now, the gas prices are much lower than the global gas market. Is that a subsidy as long as they cover the cost of the gas production? I'm not sure. I would like to hear an answer from Ron or Nelly if this is considered a subsidy or not. In my mind, subsidy is when you deliver something below cost. Take away taxes, as we have done in Norway. We took away VAT for electric cars. We pay a lot of taxes on fossil fuel cars. Is that a subsidy or not? Targeted subsidies, of course, is a much better thing than general subsidies. Now, we have seen in my country, electric cars with no taxes are bought by the high income segment of the people. They can afford it. Low income people, they buy diesel cars. They can only afford one car. Another aspect is European support for agriculture, farming, very high energy intensity. Is that subsidy? How do we calculate? How is that shown on the chart? I don't see that. There are so many complicated issues here. And I would like to have some comment from Ron or Nelly on how we can explain this better if they are still online. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Before handing it over to Ron, please, Russian Federation. So I think then we can put it together in the answers.
Thank you, Chair. You see how easily we can fill the gap, you know. Okay, just answering to some comments made by the European colleagues. First of all, I would argue that the purpose of the Paris Agreement is to eliminate all greenhouse gases. Those technically won't be possible, because for that you would have to eliminate all the cattle, and, you know, God forbid, I'm myself here producing around 20 liters of CO2 per hour. So the purpose of the Paris Agreement is basically to balance the emissions versus the consumption. So, and for that, I would recommit my country's commitments, or I'll be repeating myself, to the Paris goal of limiting temperature increases. And again, would say that we are happy to see that the Paris Agreement has a specific mentioning in an article saying that we are up to choose the program, national program would be best to achieve this goal. And I would totally concur with a colleague from Norway. We are coming from different regions of the world, and where it is easier to produce a product or install an infrastructure in place that in other part of the region that would need some support from the government. That's also what we are doing. So secondly, like, I started my intervention with saying that we were reluctant, saying we did not really oppose to it. We did not. We basically agreed to including this in the scope of the committee. So I was just explaining myself, saying why we were reluctant. And now again, I'm sort of like having the same intentions, you know, listening to the discussion. And the last point I would like to make, we did not, according to the list of speakers, there was not like a cancellation, that was a substitution. So yeah, with that I would finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Russian Federation. So especially given the case of Russia, you could also consider, and you are considering this as a country, how to evaluate the carbon sinks. So there's also a price coming with this, in this sense, a negative price, or which is positive in the economic calculation. So we can include a lot of aspects into this further debate. But then I would like to hand over for the last round for answering the questions, especially by Norway, to start with Ron, followed by Nelly, and then to come to a conclusion. Ron, please go ahead.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Chair. And very interesting discussion. On the question, if I may start with the questions from the gentleman from the Russian Federation. Two things. One on renewable energy. Certainly, my understanding is that this work program wants to look at subsidies to all sorts of energy, and the International Energy Agency does do some work on measuring subsidies to renewable energy. These take various forms. They often, probably the largest part of it is what they call feed-in tariffs so it's in a sense a production-related tariff benefit to generating electricity from renewable energy, particularly wind power and solar power. So there are numbers for that that the IEA produces, and if I assume that those are publicly available. There's also a lot of pretty good information on subsidies to, for example, government expenditure and R&D, and there are probably quite a number of grants, particularly on the consumption side, like say grants for installing solar panels on home roofs. So this information is available, and I certainly agree that the subsidies are large. the subsidies numbers for the OECD are not in the millions. They are in the billions. You know, so for example, in Europe, until the end of 2018, there was a significant amount of hard coal, underground hard coal production that was being subsidized, and that amounted to several $billion a year. Several billion euros a year, but commendably, at the end of 2018, those subsidized mines had to close. I just also wanted to remind that the why various organizations are already calculating subsidies to fossil fuels for at least some of the UNECE members, and that's because of the commitment made by the G20 nations, which included the Russian Federation, back in 2009, which was to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies over the medium term that contribute to wasteful consumption. So there's also a trade element or let's say trade interest to fossil fuel subsidies. Way back in the late 1980s, I was involved in an exercise to quantify the production, the amount of money going to support production of coal mining in Europe. And Australia, which was a major coal exporter, took a big interest in that, and that resulted in a standstill agreement between Australia and the EU, in which the EU said, okay, we won't allow any increase in the subsidies for coal production. Norway asked a specific question about using the example of subsidies to, or let's say, low prices for natural gas in Iran. This is certainly a question that was much debated in some of the early discussions I was involved with in the G20, where low-cost producers of oil and gas say, well, if we're covering the cost of production, how can that be a subsidy? But in traditional subsidy accounting, it's not just cost, but opportunity cost. So there is a government, there has to be a government policy in order to get to the point of where your domestic prices are lower than export or import parity. It may be an export tax. It may be using a state-owned enterprise and then having a dual pricing system. But otherwise, what you would see in particularly oil exporting countries is that it would be much more profitable for the oil companies to be selling at international prices if it were not for the policy that says, no, you shall sell at these lower domestic prices. So, there's separate from the question of good and bad subsidies and whether there are better alternatives to providing the same kind of support for particularly to vulnerable populations. Most people who measure subsidies, and that's certainly in the same way that one quantifies subsidies in agriculture, is you look at you compare the domestic price with the international price. To allow time, I'll stop there, but if I haven't answered all the questions, I'm happy to come back.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ron. Yeah, indeed, we are running out of time. So therefore, I would now like to invite Nelly if she has an additional comment or responding to questions, and then finalize this session.
Yes, thank you, Jürgen, and thank you everybody for the questions. I think they are really excellent questions, and we've heard this type of discussions in different fora and with different countries. What I wanted to say is that we all know that identifying and estimating subsidies is a difficult issue. And it's a politically very sensitive issue, which makes the whole exercise even more complicated, and maybe one of the main reasons why governments are so reluctant to deal with this issue, I would say. But what I've seen in my work with the countries in this particular region that I was telling you about a bit earlier is that in general, there is very little interest in an open debate on this issue in the countries. I would also say, if it is not for international institutions like OECD or UN agencies or other international organizations who are a little bit pushing, you know, to raise the profile of this issue on the political agenda, there will be almost no discussion in the countries. As I said earlier, the discussion boils down to tariffs, you know, energy tariffs. And nobody wants to look at the bigger picture. I mean, when I was talking about direct budget support or tax expenditure, we have countries like like Azerbaijan, like Russia, Kazakhstan, particularly, you know, Ukraine, producers of energy, of fossil fuels, where you have a lot of companies which have special tax regimes with individual state. And these are complete black boxes. Nobody knows exactly what happens there. And I'm sure that if ever the state or anybody is allowed to look at the contracts between the state and such companies, oil producing or gas producing companies, you will see many more real subsidy measures provided by the state particularly through the tax code, through tax expenditure and tax breaks. So we don't know everything. We don't know, we need to know much more. And I think starting with identifying the measures and trying to put a number on that is already a big, I would say, a big achievement, because it allows at least countries to think about what happens with their budgets, what happens with their public finances. And it may not look as a very ambitious, I would say, purpose of the exercise, but at least you put some order in your books. And this is the bare minimum that countries have to do. I would personally like to see more interest by the countries, by the governments themselves, to do some work on their own instead of waiting for international institutions to drive this process. I would be very happy to see, this type of discussion among the countries, even if they don't do everything correct. The very fact that they try to look into these issues and to have discussions within the government on fossil fuel subsidies, for example, is for me already an achievement, because you cannot think about reforms and what you need to do unless you understand the basics. And the basics is you have to see where the gaps are, where the subsidy measures are, and how much they cost the budget, for example. In terms of renewables, do we need to look at the renewables? Absolutely, yes. And then we will not talk about fossil fuel subsidies. We will talk about energy subsidies. Ron was saying IEA are already doing a lot of work. We were trying earlier ourselves at the OECD within the region to look at these numbers. And I can tell you, 4 or 5 years ago, the numbers were completely uncomparable. The levels were, subsidies, call it good subsidies or positive subsidies going to green, to renewables, were so insignificant, they were invisible. We could not even compare them. I do think they're growing. We saw this already in Ukraine. Numbers are growing, but there are, of course, a lot of issues related to feed-in tariffs, how feed-in tariffs are set in the countries. I think it's a major issue, how to estimate the feed-in tariff that governments have to offer to producers of green energy. I'm Bulgarian.
Sorry, I think we have to come to an end.
Yes, and I
otherwise,
wanted to say, on carbon pricing, there is very little discussion in this particular region as well, because we have some attempts in Kazakhstan Ukraine is the only country where there is an explicit carbon price already introduced through the legislation. Armenia is talking to do something in the future, but again, there is very little interest in this issue. And as I said, my bottom line is that I think governments should try to do more on their own instead of waiting for outside institutions to drive the process in the countries.
Thank you very much, and thank you both panelists, and especially here also the others for the lively discussion. I think there's much to do in the follow-up. I think we will come back to this later and also discuss it in the bureau, how to develop activity areas to deal with everything which was touched upon this morning. So thank you very much. Then I would like, as we have now come to an end with agenda item 6, to go through the conclusions and recommendations. We can also do it the other way around and stop with the next session at 12:30 so that we can do it for 6 and 7 together. Scott, what is your recommendation?
I think the next item, which is supposed to start in 3 minutes, is scheduled for an hour and a half, if I'm right about that. So we are going to be pressed on that. I do recommend that we move to the next, just to get started on time. They've got people online ready to go. We are going to have to get to the conclusions and recommendations. And I see the European Union wants to intervene.
Thank you, Scott. I think it would be good to look into the conclusions and recommendations now, at least to share comments, first set of comments on the recommendations so that we can try to even find an informal solution over the lunch break.
Yes, so I think that as there might be, it was already touched upon that there might be some controversial comments, and therefore it's a good proposal. I think it should not take us too long time.
Okay, we're going to bring the text up for all of the panels including the 3 panels from yesterday and today. And I'll read through them. If you could make it slightly larger and scroll down to the relevant paragraph. It's item 6. Here we are. So if I can read through this right now, it's starting with number 29. After the discussions, the committee, noting that ECOSOC adopted its decision on the best practice guidance for effective methane recovery and use from abandoned coal mines, welcomed the attention given by member states to mitigate and/or prevent methane emissions from abandoned coal mines, called upon member states to address methane emissions from active coal mines that are much higher in volume than those from abandoned coal mines and that continue to escape to the atmosphere from coal mines across the UNECE region. If you could scroll up a bit more, please. In this regard, invited member states to obtain a better understanding of the amounts of methane being released from active coal mines through improved measurement and reporting methods, more accurate inventories, and participation in the work of the group of experts on coal mine methane and international fora, fostering exchange of information and experience on those emissions. Endorsed the contribution of the group of experts on coal mine methane to the development and dissemination of standards for coal mine closure, which is section 5 of the reference report, noting with appreciation the growing interest from member states and organizations, including the Global Methane Initiative, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and the World Meteorological Organization, to enhance concrete actions to mitigate methane emissions, encouraged member states to support a resolution at the United States General Assembly on declaring an international decade for methane management. An indicative sample of a declaration is presented in the annex to the reference document, a call to action on methane. Further noted that preparation of a draft resolution will require active engagement of one or more countries to take the lead in drafting and proposing a document for consideration by UN member states. That's the first panel from yesterday. Do you want me to go through all of them, or should we go one by one?
As long as there's no intervention, I think you can continue.
Buildings. So 31, after the discussion, the committee, noting with appreciation the progress in pursuing the High Performance Buildings Initiative, requested the Secretariat to continue developing the network of international centers of excellence on high performance buildings, to support the global building network of academic institutions working on research and education for the built environment, to extend the industry leadership group to develop case studies on application of high performance buildings principles, to continue convening the thought leadership group to elaborate the outcomes expected of high performance buildings. And then in addition, based on the discussion yesterday, given the extensiveness of the network, and to support institution of a dedicated secretariat to coordinate the various elements of the initiative.
Yeah, I just have a question concerning the dedicated secretariat. What does it mean for the UNECE and your secretariat? Will it be linked or completely independent?
Irish government is coming forward with a significant package of support to institute a secretariat explicitly, almost as its own center of excellence, but it's actually a secretariat for the network with financial support. And then the other centers of excellence would be funding that. It would be separate from ECE and it would be having a relationship to us, but it would not be part of our secretariat.
Okay, thank you.
That's good. So if we can scroll down, please.
Yeah,
oh, wait,
Russia.
Sorry. If Russia wants to
Well, I'm sure in other circumstances we probably would support it, but within the UN, you know that there is a special bunch of people called Fifth Committee experts, and I'll probably have to really spend a lot of time in their room after I get back from here if I actually pass this right on without having a detailed written explanation of what is supposed to be done, and especially for how we would do it within existing budget or additional contributions. And for that, I would also need to have some real commitment from potential supporters of this initiative. So at this stage, I mean, we would gladly consider it if we would have like more written data on that one, especially with some good authoritative signatures under it. But at this stage, I mean, I won't be able to accommodate the last edition, which is highlighted in green. Thank you.
I think I wasn't clear in my answer to the question that was raised. This would not be funding to ECE to establish a secretariat. It would not be regular budget. It would not be extra budgetary. It's actually funded by others as part of the external activities. So the only relationship with us is informational.
Well, in this case, I don't think the committee is in a position to endorse such recommendation because, well, we are probably authorized to endorse recommendations for the UNECE system and its secretariat and what it's doing here. But for a side structure, I don't think we are in place to have such in the text, such proposal in the text. Thank you.
Thank you, Russia. I do understand. So, European Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. European Union. Just maybe in follow-up to the comments from the Russian Federation, I tend to agree, and I think we could take note with appreciation of the intention to institute an external dedicated secretariat to make it clear that it's not within UNECE.
Would you agree, Russia?
Well, in that case, you would have to specify whose intention. I haven't heard anyone intending to do that so far.
Maybe we can put it in brackets here, and over the lunch you try to find a yes, okay, good, thank you. Then Scott, please.
Yes, if we can scroll down please to 33. This is on sustainable resource management. After the discussion, the committee, noting that ECOSOC adopted its decision on the updated UNFC, encouraged member states to consider taking measures to ensure application of UNFC worldwide, and requested the Secretariat to work with the other regional commissions and relevant international organizations to do the same. I note that the footnote, by the way, is that ECOSOC decision. B, noted with appreciation the development of the United Nations Resource Management System, UNRMS, based on principles and requirements included in the document UNRMS System Guiding Principles and Structure, with the reference, and recommended accelerated development of UNRMS. Requested the Secretariat to raise funds and mobilize the expert communities needed to advance development of UNRMS. Requested the Secretariat to publish the UNRMS when ready in the 6 UN languages to facilitate worldwide application. Noted with appreciation the growing interest from member states, including in Europe, Kazakhstan, Russian Federation, UK, United Kingdom, China, and Mexico, to establish international centers of excellence on sustainable resource management in the ECE region and beyond, and requested the Secretariat to work to facilitate their institution. Noted the United Nations Secretary General's policy brief on transforming extractive industries for sustainable development, and encouraged member states to act on the 18 calls for action contained therein. You can scroll up a bit, please. Noting that progress towards a more circular economy is crucial for sustainable management of natural resources, requested the expert group on resource management to explore supporting alternative approaches, such as resources as a service, to improve the efficiency of resource production and use, including the critical raw materials required for the low carbon energy transitions. Such activities could align with other similar principles, such as energy as a service and mobility as a service. Noting the need for rapid expansion of renewable energy in many member states, requested the expert group on resource management to support the application of UNFC and UNRMS to renewable energy in close cooperation with a group of experts on renewable energy, considering the diversity of sources, modes of production, models such as zero energy neighborhoods, linkages to the food, water, energy nexus, and the role of micro, medium, and small enterprises. Noting the potential for integrated hydrogen resource management in clean energy transitions. This is actually quite changed, so I'll read it more slowly. Noting the potential for integrated hydrogen resource management in clean energy transitions, and the proposal from the Russian Federation to create a task force to develop a clean energy index as part of the development of UNRMS, and pending availability of extra budgetary resources. There's a bit of an English issue here, but requested the expert group on resource management, the group of experts on gas, and the group of experts on cleaner electricity systems to develop international standards for hydrogen classification and management, including labeling according to its origin and CO2 footprint. And more generally, and building on existing tools, a standard for transparency and traceability that compares, among other things, the carbon footprint of all energy sources on a life cycle assessment basis. I think we should put brackets around that language because I don't think colleagues have had an opportunity to consider it.
Your opinion,
I just have 2 quick comments or questions. In paragraph G, I think we should refer to sustainable resource management. So integrated hydrogen sustainable resource management, because that's what we're doing, I assume. And I think also in the IDENT I, International Standard for Sustainable Hydrogen Classification and Management.
So I would have a question, what is meant under Clean Energy Index? So if this cannot be clarified now, I think that we should put this in brackets. Russia, please.
Thank you. Well, definitely we would need to come back to those ones. First of all, can we also just scroll up a bit to, first of all, item C. I think there is some first editorial change needed here, including in Europe, Kazakhstan, Russian Federation needs to be specified, like Europe as a region, or because there are countries listed here and it goes in Europe, or they cannot, like, I mean, also the list here does not include all European countries. So yeah, I think it could be corrected somehow here and the rest. Second, in the same item, we would rather request the Secretariat to present proposals on how to facilitate their institutions rather than facilitate their institution as such, because I don't think we're not at this stage. If I'm wrong, just correct me. I believe we rather still at the stage where we study the feasibility of the institution of such centers. Yeah, I'll just address the other issues when we first end with this one.
Just to be clear, the Russian Federation would be first out the gate, and there is a proposal that will go to ExCom with funding and with the whole concept that has been developed. So your point about Europe is very correct. We should specify the countries rather than having in one list region and then countries. But regarding the state of play, we're not at the design phase. We're actually moving into implementation phase. Could I ask my colleague to intervene on that one? Charlotte, could you come in, please?
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, no, fully support that. We have been working, the expert group has been working for more than 2 years now on developing, for example, the generic criteria for the terms of reference and who can be designated as a International Centre of Excellence on Sustainable Resource Management. I think that was mentioned at the committee meeting last year, and it's those criteria and generic terms of reference are referenced in the committee meeting report. They're available on the website, and fully support what you've said. The Russian Federation, I think we're hoping to go to the executive committee meeting in December. We're just doing the final checks and balances and the due diligence of the vehicle that will be the International Centre of Excellence on Sustainable Resource Management in Moscow, that will work not only for the Russian Federation, but also for Eurasian countries more generally. And there are discussions advancing as well with a number of the other countries that are mentioned there on the screen. And also in terms of Europe, I agree that should be changed. And we heard yesterday that there is an intention or interest from Slovenia, for example, to establish a Centre of Excellence, so we can absolutely modify that text. Thank you.
Russian Federation.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm not worrying about myself on this list. I mean, I know pretty much where we stand on that, but I'm worrying about other countries on the list here. If everyone listed here is okay with this language, then we're also okay with that. I'm just trying sort of like to lend a hand of help for others, because I'm not sure they're at the same stage as we are on this one. But yeah, if there are no points coming on this one, then it's fine on that. Also, should I proceed? Okay, thank you. There is one more comment on the item B right before that. normally, like I'm looking at the end of this item, so to publish the UNECE and facilitate worldwide implications. I rather first have a question to the Secretariat whether we have already previously agreed that we're just already have included the words regarding the worldwide implication before that, because like as a bureaucrat, I would tend first to see what is published and then decide whether we're spreading it around the world. So, but if there have been provisions already regarding the UN RMS that it should, which would specifically say that we're going for facilitating or like going for worldwide implication, that again, I would agree with it already like screen text. If not, I would rather put a stop after publishing it in 6 UN languages. Then we'll take a look at it, then we decide what to do with it right after. So again, yeah, here is mostly the question. Thank you.
The UNFC is the foundation for UNRMS, and at each stage in its evolution, it has been recommended by ECOSOC for worldwide dissemination. Given what we've done with the Secretary General and that whole process, the expectation and the anticipation is that it'll have similar applicability. Having said that, I think the easiest thing now is simply to accept your comment, to delete that. We have it ready in the 6 languages, and at the appropriate time, we can take that further decision. I'm looking to Charlotte to make sure she's not going to crucify me after this session.
No, you've only got till May, so I can last till then. Thank you. I jest, sorry. Thank you very much. No, I fully support what you've said, what you've just said, and yeah, no comments, fully support it. Thank you.
Okay, can we go ahead?
All right, if we can scroll back to the next. And I think we put some brackets around G because you wanted to come back after lunch. Sorry.
You basically had an addition on this item coming from our expert yesterday. But yeah, I would rather defer the discussion on this one because it's going to take really long time. And yeah, I think that would be all. Yes, at this stage. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, then let's scroll on down then to subsidies and carbon prices. Oh, sorry.
Apologies very quickly, and then I'm ready for the carbon prices and subsidies. Clean energy is not a term that we use very much in this committee. We're a sustainable energy committee, so further to the clarifications, we also have some reservations about the actual language. And I see that we actually have clean energy transitions also in the second line. So there, I think we should have sustainable energy transitions as I'm at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can come back after the lunch break with a proposal. Scott.
All right, if we can scroll down then to subsidies and carbon prices. We go down to 35 because the other's background. The committee noting that production and consumption subsidies in energy systems distort market equilibria and misdirect investment portfolios, and that there is a wide range of approaches to pricing greenhouse gases, requested that the Secretariat, pending available resources, assemble a task force reporting to the committee to assess the consequences of energy subsidies, the opportunities for their rationalization, and to explore alternative mechanisms for pricing greenhouse gas emissions.
Russia.
I mean, again, we are basically not running on the time limit. So I would also like bracket the whole section here and just proceed it in lunchtime, and then just, because I have like quite a lot of comments on that one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would simply like to note that there's been quite a lot of work done by this committee in previous times on the issue of subsidies. We have a number of energy series, just so it is part of the genetics of the committee. I'll stop there. I think we're done, and I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I think so. We will come back. This is 2 paragraphs at 3 p.m. And hopefully find a solution during the lunch break. Okay, then we can continue with the next agenda item 7. It's under the future work of the Committee on Sustainable Energy. We will have the rest of the day for this agenda item, and starting this morning with a panel on just transition. And I would like to give the floor to Ray Pilcher, the group chair of the expert group on coal mine methane.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a very interesting previous session, and I think it illustrates, as was mentioned a couple of times by the Russian Federation, that these are complex issues. And the next issue promises to be also complex. And I think that many of the people that were expecting, in fact, all of the people that were expecting to talk, except my colleague, Mr. Drobik, are online at this point. What I'd like to do, because our time has been cut short, is to move right into it. I have a couple of comments, and then I want to introduce our panelists. The group of experts on coal mine methane has been engaged over the last several years discussing complex industrial complexes that include coal mining and other fossil fuels, and looking at what happens when coal mines are closed or oil and gas facilities are closed, and how these industrial complexes unravel. In the ensuing years, we've also seen a dramatic change in closures of facilities throughout the world as energy transition takes place. And we understand that this is also a multidimensional and complex issue. And for this reason, we assembled a group of colleagues that can address many of the factors that actually lead to or could lead to what we would all agree would be a just transition. The panel today represents some of the, I think, thought leaders, people who are involved in the actual practice and are concerned in their own countries about just transition, either through the work they're doing directly or through the support that they provide for member states. I'm going to introduce the panelists at this point. The first, who was not able to actually either be with us live here in the room or online, will actually present through a recording that we'll start with first in a moment. The gentleman's name is Dr. Hans Rüdiger Lange. He's a professor at the Brandenburg Technical University, and he's worked also in the Lausitz region of Eastern Germany, hands-on, working with how once coal mines are closed and power plants are being shuttered, what happens with the people and what you can do to both work on restoration of the region, but also ensuring that there is good work for the people that are remaining. The next is my friend and colleague to the left, Michael Drobik, who is a member of the Secretariat and is the secretary of the group of experts on coal mine methane. And he has been involved in these discussions over the last few years, and will have some interesting comments and his observations. A third is Ms. Valentina Moskalenko. She's advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine, is directly involved in just transition issues in Ukraine as it begins to close some of its facilities and move into its energy transition. Also, we have Professor Raphael Hevron, who is a professor at Dundee University. He's actually with the Center of Just Transition to a Low Carbon Energy Economy. He's a barrister. He's highly regarded, and the number of publications he has on these topics are staggering, and they're oft quoted and translated into a number of languages. And in fact, he's will publish, or a book that he has written will be published later this year called Just Transition to a Low Carbon Economy. And then finally, Dr. Michael Stanley, who is the lead of extraction group for the World Bank, and was also the global lead for the World Bank in support of energy transition in coal regions. He's involved in policy, obviously lending, looking at repurposing these lands, and the good governance that must take place for all of these activities to be facilitated. With that, I would like to begin with this the short video that we have queued up from Dr. Lange, and then we'll move forward with the live discussion. Can we have that, please?
I'm Hans Rüdiger Lange, and it's a pleasure to have the honor to contribute with my experience from coal transition region to this panel and also to this event. I have been from 2016 to 2021 in the role of heading a little incubator, Innovationsregion Lausitz GmbH, in the mining region of Lusatia, Lausitz, some 120 to 150 kilometers south of Berlin. There we still produce today something like 10% of Germany's electricity production. And we went through coal exit process, which just started in 2015. I want shortly to give an overview of what happened, what did we do, and what are the learnings so far. So, what happened? In 2015, the German government actually drafted a first law to shut down 2.7 gigawatt of coal-fired power plants. And this was a shock to the region, because in this initial concept, it would have threatened the operation of this mining area and power plants on a very short time scale. So there were a number of demonstrations, there were protests, there were decisions of local parliaments not to follow this kind of path of coal exit. And then after these demonstrations, and there was nevertheless a decision to take out these 2.7 gigawatt of coal-fired power plants. And at the regional level, the key players, companies, as business associations, and the university, actually they convened and said, hey, we can't block probably this process driven by climate policies. We have to address the issue, how can we think about the future beyond coal, and what does it mean to the region. So within something like 8 weeks, they pulled together a group of organizations so that they collected money and started this little Innovationsregion Lausitz GmbH, which had 3 tasks. One thing was to develop a strategy, how to cope as a region with this challenge. Second, to work with the affected companies in the supply chain, especially also the smaller ones, to help them make up their mind and develop approaches to survival and to diversification. And the third task was to identify innovation projects which could help the region to generate new work. I was assigned to be responsible for this little team. So we set up an incubator. We had a place in a villa where it was a place where people could come and teams from companies. So in the first phase, we just were listening to the firms. We were talking with different participants, stakeholders. We set up the management board. Actually, it was complemented by associated members from the cities. So the city council members of some of the major cities of the region were present on the board as associated members, as well as representatives from the regional states. And we created also an advisory board, which had a much larger representation of the region with NGOs, with the churches, with the trade unions, which was a kind of resonating chamber to discuss the issues we were facing and discussing on the board and in the little incubator to discuss it in a larger group of a larger range of stakeholders of the regional ecosystem. And so in this first phase of dialogue and exchange, we were also kind of contact point for the state level and the regional level. So there was somebody to talk with in the region. We went also to look into other experience of regions which have done these kind of transformations so that we could develop our own approach and own strategy. And this strategy became what we call akteurzentrierter Strukturwandel, an entrepreneurial regional transformation process, which centers very much on the individuals and the small firms in order to take them action to look for their own future and to work together to do this jointly as a region. In the second phase, we pushed a lot for projects and initiatives, so and also some educational measures, so that we focused on enabling the affected people in the firms and in the companies to take ownership of the transformation. So we had a lot of workshops running in our incubator. We were the place to connect into other firms, into the research scene, but also internationally to relate to experts in various fields where companies intended to go. And as an outcome of this second phase, which ran probably until 2018, we had more than 100 innovation projects, each innovation project being a vision of a company or an individual to create new jobs or increase export revenues outside of the region on an horizon of 2025, relatively short horizon, because we felt an urgency to look for fast and business close to market ideas and projects at the first stage. And then at the third stage, we actually looked into how to group, make clusters of these innovation projects so that we can build strategic initiatives, which then would have much more resources, cloud, and also maybe the potential to get some external financing. And we did this by looking through this portfolio of over 100 projects, and wherever there were more than 6 projects with the same or similar capability in the region and vision for export outside, then we group these into fields of strategic initiatives. And just one example is that we try to take the capability of industrial processes where we have lots of knowledge and experts and link it to digitalization. So this became a strategic innovation initiative of industrial automation. And we actually built a co-innovation platform for that. We got some research funding, and we are just trying now to set up an institute with the local university on artificial intelligence in these kind of processes. So you see, we try to scale up and structure the kind of potentials identified by the individuals in the first place. That was the third phase, and building structures, reconfiguring our regional innovation ecosystem. And that's also where then the politics actually came in. By 2019, the government actually had put up a commission on coal exit, which determined the date of coal exit for Germany, 2038. Might be that it's much earlier also when you see the current elections in Germany. They selected an end date for coal-based electricity generation, and they created 2 laws which came into place 2020. One to shut down the plants, regulating the shutdown of the plants, and another one of assistance to the mining regions affected. And so by 2021, then actually governmental structures on the country level, or which is the state level, so to speak, in Germany, the regional states, they started to put up structures which would then take the responsibilities to develop actually this transition and to also fund certain projects. So by the beginning of 2021, the state structures were put in place and started operation. And that's where was also the moment where actually this bottom-up initiative, this incubator and this Innovationsregion Lausitz GmbH, actually we stopped this operation, because now the state structures would take over a large part of these responsibilities. And it's also a personal story. I actually went then from this coordinating role back into technology and business. Sorry. That's also the reason why I cannot be here tonight or today at the panel, because I'm working in a tech company now, trying to offer industrial services of energy and efficiency and decarbonization to industrial plants and firms outside of Lusatia. Thank you very much. I hope you have a fantastic panel discussion. I would really like to be there, hopefully next time, and I wish you a successful conference.
Well, I clearly we missed having Dr. Lange here, because he has actually been working on transition, and I believe he continues to in various capacities. Next, I'd like to move to Mr. Michael Drabik, who's, as I said before, the member of Secretariat and working on these just transition topics.
Thank you, Ray. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Drabik, and as Ray said, I'm the secretary of the group of experts on coal mine methane, which is to change its name to coal mine methane and just transition. And I'm here to present you with the approach that we want to take to this subject, and also to highlight one of the aspects related to just transition that it's often overlooked. I will stay in the context of social, I will stay in the social context, similarly to Dr. Lange. It's just that I would like to add this additional aspect, which is the cultural aspect, which we believe is very important once you go through this process. So for centuries, coal mining was much more than an occupation. It was a craft that was passed from father to son, and it was proudly passed from father to son. And it was also a way of life with its own traditions, legends, heroes, saints, holidays, music, clothes, language, cuisine, you name it. I mean, there was this whole microcosmos built around this one activity. So the coal mining was a social glue that kept people of a given region, of a given community together. And it also provided people with a sense of identity and belonging to a given community, and with a sense of adherence to a given culture and heritage. In the cross-border regions, historically, coal mining defined people's identities as strongly or maybe even more than the national affiliation. When you think about Europe, coal regions were often actually on the borders of 2 or more countries, and the jurisdiction under which people lived changed because the borders were changing quite often, particularly in those regions because they were rich in resources. But one thing remained constant for those people, and it was coal mining. This is why you see, in those regions, sometimes the language is often a mix of languages of the bordering countries. Therefore, the transformation need to offer the people a new, different life, which on one hand, of course, will allow them to have the sense of material security. But on the other hand, it needs to offer them also an opportunity to remain themselves culture-wise. So by nature, people fear change. This is normal. We are creatures of habits, and we feel much more at ease in our comfort zone of something that we know rather than in the unknown. And the new is always unknown and unpredictable, and this is why it is scary. So there is no surprise that workers and communities in the coal mining regions fear transition. And it might not always be articulated, but it's not just a fear of losing job, but is usually just presented. It's a fear of losing the world that they know. It's the world that not only makes sense to them, but also which defines their lives. So therefore, we believe that in order to go through the process of transformation peacefully, we must assure people that the fact that their economic activity needs to change does not mean that they have to abandon all what they know and all what they believe in. Again, the coal mining is a true culture on its own right, and as such, it should be protected in the same way as we protect certain languages, minorities, or tribes, which constitute a testimony of a human history and are a living proof of our cultural diversity. The fact that the world which gave rise to that culture is coming to an end now does not mean that the culture itself is not worth preserving. So the question is how to do that. And we believe that the answer is that the transition must come from inside, from people themselves. So nowadays, the just transition is a very popular subject and is being promoted through hundreds of projects, publications, through countless organizations and activities. And most of those initiatives have one thing in common. They offer a solution. They all claim that they know what needs to be done so that the transition process is successful. And our approach is an expression to some extent of a disagreement with such thinking. We believe that, of course, it's necessary to approach affected communities with certain offer, with a hint indicating what and how they could change to find themselves in a better position in the new economic and environmental reality. But those suggestions should not offer any preconceived solutions. They should rather inform people about the challenge that they face and about the changes that are happening around them and guide them, but again, guide and not lead through the thought process, allowing them to identify themselves what their objectives are and what are the means of achieving those objectives. So we believe that we must allow people to make their own choices, to allow them to own the process and to take the responsibility for its outcome. Transition, from our point of view, it's a task of teaching people how to fish rather than of serving them a fish on a golden platter. So if the transition is to render good and sustainable results, those results must be accepted and appreciated by communities. And harsh as it may sound, if the communities are to strive, survive and thrive, they must learn how to take care of themselves. We are here to help, but it is them who needs to do the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I think that those comments linked with the short video that we saw from Professor Lange sort of give you an idea about how those ideas and concepts can be operated by going into the region, opening offering possible solutions through incubators, et cetera. But I mean, a lot more needs to be done, and first probably assessing where each of these communities are. And in that regard, I'd like to turn to Ms. Valentina Moskalenko, who is, as I mentioned, is a advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine. She's actually dealing with some of these issues on a daily basis. Valentina, are you online? Well, it seems like we weren't able to, at least at this point, link her in. She doesn't seem to be online at this point. So with that, I'd like to move over to Professor Rafael Hevron. And I'm sorry, Rafael. When I introduced you earlier, I bungled the actual name of the center, and the center that you are associated with is the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law, and Policy, and that you are a professor that in just transition to low carbon economy. With that, please proceed.
Thank you. So if I could share my screen. So I think you have to stop sharing the current screen that's up. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here, and I'll just say a few words and try and keep below the time allotted, since we are getting pressed for time. So where am I speaking to you? Well, you know, from the University of Dundee there at the top of the UK. And I just mention it in the context of a just transition because that's where all of the oil and gas of the UK is offshore there at the top of Scotland. So we're very familiar with these issues around a just transition. And you can think of, let's say later, you know, in a couple of months, we have the big climate change conference here also in Scotland, and the big announcements that, let's say, that have been made over the last few days. We can commend President Biden on increasing the amount the US is going to contribute to developing nations, and also some of, let's say, the rhetoric that has been put forward by the UK government so far. Maybe we have to see a bit more action on that as of yet. So, I mean, what I just wanted to highlight was the ongoing and furthering relationship between international, national, and local issues around the just transition. And we see these, you know, on the rise, as we heard earlier, that you know, these just transition issues are increasingly developing at a fast pace. But just as a way maybe of reminding ourselves, you know, some of these, what do we mean in that sort of justice part? Well, when we look at the different types of literature, whether it be professional literature, policy literature, academic research literature, we see these types of justice being mentioned: distributive, procedural, recognition, restorative, cosmopolitan. I'll just quickly highlight, you know, people don't realize the cosmopolitan perspective coming in, which is increasing, that idea of being a citizen of the world. And we can even see some case law around different places in the world of late. In Australia, how a judge closed a coal mine or didn't allow the opening of a coal mine, citing that Australia didn't want to be responsible for that, the CO2 from that coal mine around the world. We can also think about, this happens in developing countries as well. Kenya rejected a big coal power project in 2019. And we can also see this week's announcement by China of not investing in coal outside of China, I think with immediate effects. So that sends a very big signal to the investor community. And we can see that replicated in one of the key research journals just published this month. And I'd be happy to share a copy of the article, but we can see in successive legal developments around the world, the big challenge to some of these energy multinationals. They are being challenged in the courts in terms of around the issue of human rights. They're being held to account, and you can see that also in the back in May. I suppose one of the more publicized cases was against Dutch Shell and how it has to comply with Paris agreements. So all this is contributing at an international level to the just transition. And then at a national level, we are seeing change. So we heard some perspective on Germany, but you can see big developments around the just transition. Governments creating some type of separate public administrative unit. And you can see that already in Scotland, Ireland, Germany, New Zealand, South Africa, US, in some states, and in Spain and a couple of other countries as well. And this is a national sort of policy unit, let's say, affiliated with one or two or three ministries or a combination. And it is trying to advance issues around the just transition at an accelerated pace. And at a national level, we're thinking about those particular units, the creation of these units, and it's something, if we are to achieve this just transition, what are the powers we're going to give to these units to help accelerate it, the members of who's going to be the members, and the goals and targets, and will these goals and targets be binding? And when we think of the coal communities, let's say around Europe, this is the particular issue. Is it going to be binding, and to what timeline is it going to be binding? We can see in the Germany case that timeline is 2038, but it is not actually fully binding. There is a get out of jail clause there. But we can think also at a local level, there is a lot of legislation in place in Europe already, and we can see here issues around regional development, which has been a key EU policy, for several decades. Also under the strategic environmental assessment legislation, we don't have to go reinventing the wheel here. And there is the possibility of achieving change and achieving more inclusivity to bring these communities on in the just transition by changing minor parts or providing a set of recommendations for changing minor parts of these legislation in different countries, which may be far more achievable, than national legislation going through Parliament. And I just wanted to reflect on one of those policy alignment issues to finish off. We think about waste management and decommissioning. And this is something where we are seeing some change already. And just in terms of this type of project life cycle, you can see here when we think about a project going from planning, construction, operation, and decommissioning. So we're thinking, how does a project develop over its life cycle? And it's something to reflect on. You could argue in the case of coal, it may be too late in some respects to think about ensuring that we have some mechanisms in place to pay for the cleanup, to ensure that the transition happens for the local communities in a just way. But you can think about future projects that, this just transition is also about thinking about the future. And we can think right from the planning and construction phase, we should already be building in that decommissioning phase. We should be building in the just transition for those local communities right at the outset when we plan and construct new projects. And that is another way of thinking about showing the communities that we are serious about this issue that we are changing for the future. So I'll finish quickly on that, and happy to take questions in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation and your comments. Those are, I think, prescient in a number of ways. Just a couple of examples. The issues relative to planning closure as you open a coal mine is something that's being addressed by some work that's being done by the World Bank on global coal mine closure standards and repurposing that comes afterwards. Also, it's true that the issues relative to closing these coal mines and the push on the budgets of various locales where this is taking place is also something that's can be extremely difficult. I know that a couple of states within the United States are actually their funds for closing mines and restoring and doing other work, not to even mention the transition work that has to happen at the community level, are essentially bankrupt, that the money that was put aside to do those closures essentially no longer exists. With that, I'd like to turn to the last panelist that we have online at this point is Dr. Michael Stanley. With that, Michael, I'd like to turn over this to you for your comments.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to speak with you this afternoon and to have the opportunity to address this panel. I will respond using some of the speaker guideline points that were provided to us from the beginning. The first was to reflect on lessons learned from the past. And I'll just begin by saying that the World Bank Group, we're quite committed to support coal mine closure and thermal plant closures under a just transition. We have a 2021 climate action plan that makes that commitment. And we continually review our past. We look at our experiences, we summarize our lessons learned, we publish them. And we do this so that we can strengthen a systematic approach that really could be tailored to any coal region. I'll just mention that in 2018, we updated our global approach using our lessons learned. And we rebalanced across 3 pillars. The first pillar was to focus much more on strengthening institutional governance. And that's something that through the 1990s and early 2000s, I don't think we saw enough of that, really making a strong institutional governance to manage the process. And I'll speak to that further below. The second was obviously to manage social impacts on workers and communities. We have always done that. We previously emphasized more the workers than the communities. And so we are rebalancing to workers and communities to ensure that we have a very holistic social approach. And then the third is to ensure appropriate environmental remediation that leads to repurposing of lands and assets. And as Dr. Pilcher just said, we are indeed preparing some global standards for environmental remediation that de-risk lands and assets that are being decommissioned so that private investors can come in and use those. To ensure that we balance across these 3 pillars, good governance, that we have better management of social impacts, and that we have appropriate environmental remediation, we use a triple bottom line now in an approach that we call, it's continuous learning. So we continue to learn as we go, and it's a programmatic approach, which means it has many phases. So we'll help governments and enterprises and workers and communities to take some action around closures. We'll stop and we'll assess the outcomes, looking at, did we have good governance? Was it an inclusive process? Was there strong stakeholder consultation? We'll make sure that workers and communities were provided the social support was necessary, and to make sure that we had good environmental remediation and that many of those assets could be made available for investors for repurposing. So we take an action, we stop, we assess, we learn, we improve, and then we take another action. So it's this multi-phased approach. And with that approach now, our assistance runs much longer. So a typical operation could run certainly 8 to 10 years in length. The institutional side of the transition process was another point that was provided to the panel, and I want to speak to that. I think we have to begin to recognize that these will be long-lived transitions. They'll certainly last more than a decade in many coal regions. And where disruption has not yet impacted these regions, we still need to act now. There's not a lot of time to not act. So good institutional practices that strengthen the institution for this. First is that we are spending a lot more time in planning and preparing, helping coal regions to design a strategy Perhaps it's not surprising, but many coal regions still don't have a strategy for transition. And these strategies must be bespoke to each coal region. And of course, they have to be created using extensive and continuous consultation across a very broad diversity of stakeholders. I want to mention that this diversity of stakeholders really has to include the direct and indirect workers, the enterprises, small to medium enterprises that may be in that value chain, the government at the central, state, district, and municipal level, non-governmental organizations, and of course the private sector, which could come in and repurpose lands and assets. Secondly, we are improving upon moving to action so that strategies have associated transition projects, which can be piloted early in the programs from which we can then also learn and improve upon as we go forward. And we must make sure that agencies and programs and services are ready for the transition and for those pilot projects. We spent a lot of time, as I said, strengthening institutional governance. One thing that was previously mentioned is that there's a need to modernize policies and the regulatory framework. We find that often the policies and frameworks that are available in countries were used to open mines, to perhaps open a coal mine, and they're really not fit for purpose in terms of closure activities. And so new standards are needed to ensure that the regulations and policies ensure that there's proper closure of these assets in a very socially, environmentally sustainable way. And as I said previously, on the environment, that we can de-risk so we have appropriate environmental remediation of coal assets and lands, so the private sector can indeed come in and make that much needed investment in the region post-coal industry. We were asked to also comment upon the challenges that are encountered by the communities. And this, I think, is the crux of my points. The first is that there's very weak coordination. Often there's no ministry that has responsibility on such a multifaceted challenge as coal transition. And rather, many ministries at the central, state, or regional level have narrow remits on different aspects or key issues. And this has served to create a very fragmented and at times uncoordinated approach. So coordination is essential. Secondly, that has prevented community dialogue and consultation in very effective ways. Different ministries have different cohorts locally, and so we have to address that as we go forward. And as a third point, we're finding that there is an opportunity in many countries now for a special purpose entity that could be a collection of ministries. It could have industry, non-governmental organizations, community members. But a special purpose entity can play a very strong role in coordinating a complex closure process. And it can really help to identify stakeholder needs, vision at the local level, and all that was, all that was being lost in the previous approaches that we had. And importantly, the special purpose entity can also reach out to the private sector. So it's that bridge between public sector and private sector. I will go to my final point, which is that a holistic transition for just transition, it really has to remain linked with an accelerating energy transition. So we have this coupling, we have just transition support, and we have an accelerating energy transition. And we have to make sure that there are no gaps, that layoffs that may occur and reskilling and education opportunities anticipate that and can move workers to new spaces in the economy. So there's need for us to be very vigilant that as the energy transition accelerates, that we have appropriate plans and strategies and implementation activities that are matched to an ever accelerating energy transition. And I think that would be a challenge for us going forward. And that's probably a point of further discussion by the panel. Let me just summarize. We have to work together as a global community. And I think that really to succeed on just transition, we must all continuously look at our lessons learned, accept faults and failures of the past, and update our knowledge and disseminate that to this broad, diverse stakeholder group. We really do have to move beyond support at the national level to the region, to the state, and then the region, and then down to the municipalities where workers and communities live, so that push down to the local communities. And to do so, we really have to build stronger implementation support at the local level. They will be responsible for implementing the strategies and these pilot and transition projects. And so we really have a responsibility to ensure that they have the technical capacities that are required to do that. So those are some key points reflecting on the questions that were posed to the panel. And with that, I will stop. I thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. And we want to come back and revisit some of the comments and how they might interact in a sense with some of the comments that the other panelists have made. I'm about ready to open up the discussion here as well. And excuse me.
If I could just interrupt you for a moment. I see that we have online also Ms. Bobby Foot. She's an expert who's been working with us on many issues. Maybe it would be a good idea if Ms. Bobby Foot agreed to also ask her to say a couple of words on those issues.
Well, I think that'd be wonderful. Bobby Foot came to our group of experts meeting a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, with if you subtract out the COVID year. And she was here to talk to us about gender issues in mining. She works in Australia, and so I think it'd be an excellent opportunity if Bobby could intervene at this point. Bobby, are you there?
Yes, just checking that you can hear me.
We can.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chair. Certainly, the panelists have touched on a number of points that are quite relevant to something that I'd like to share, which is the approach that we use for transitions. And this can be transitions of all kinds, but may be particularly relevant to just transitions, because a number of points made are things that we're working with. So some legislation that was recently introduced within Queensland in Australia about 3 years ago around mine site rehabilitation, and in particular making sure that you manage your rehabilitation as you go, so that there aren't legacy issues left, and that there's appropriate financial bonds and so forth for that. Built into the process of that is a process where you must define your post-mining land use, and you must consult with community and other stakeholders about that, which actually then starts to bring in the social process of what does the community want? What do they want that region to be? What do they want? It's specifically around what mine do they want, but when you've got a region that has or a town that has a number of mines around it, everybody from all of the different mines need to go consult with that community. And that can be quite overwhelming for a community that maybe doesn't really want to make a transition right now as well. So one of the things that we've done as part of BHP is set up Smart Transformation Advisory Councils is the name of one of them. And that's looked at different community stakeholders, business folks, councils, local government, schools, etc. as well. And we've also got a youth advisory council, which is high school students, to actually get some of the different perspectives, and particularly some of the future looking perspectives. And that's to deal with all kinds of transitions. So it's dealing with things like fourth industrial revolution and how mines might change, all the way through to post-mining land use for whatever reason, and end of mine life, etc. And the new legislation kind of forces forces people to be thinking about that at the start of mines, and for all existing mines must go through a transition with it as well to actually set that up. And those advisory councils have already proved really valuable through rapid changes with COVID and so forth, in how those communities adapted, and some really great feedback that is actually coming back and opening up a dialogue, building trust, and starting to work on it. So I really agree with Mr. Stanley's comments about the best time to act is now. I'd probably say the best time to act was yesterday, and the second best time is now. So really like that thinking around forward planning, and it does mean that we actually need to start building that now. And the other comment that I'd make on that, along the lines of what I presented on previously, is we need to look at what are the structural inequalities that might already be there. And as we go through transitions, should we try to make those better? Certainly not trying to make them worse. So that means things like involving young people, involving Indigenous groups, other cultural groups in rural and regional areas as well. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate those comments. I want to try one more time to see if Valentina is online. If you're online and we're not seeing you, will you indicate it in some way so that we can bring you on? Okay. Unfortunately, I guess we missed that opportunity. So I would like to open up the discussion to the floor at this point, if there are any questions. If not, I have a couple that I'd like to pose to the panelists. Is there anyone? I don't see any flags up at this point. Well, while you're considering potential questions, one of the things that I observed, and Dr. Stanley touched on it a bit, and it impinges on some of the comments that Professor Heffron made, and that is that in many cases, these transitions are not like a discrete thing in time, but actually end up being a rolling set of issues that go across a region or a country or even a state. So that what we see is sort of an uneven approach even within one state. And if we talk about it at a country level, any of the countries that are in the European region at this point are in the ECE region, which includes obviously Canada and the United States and Central Asia as well, we see that there's an opportunity to maybe look at a more holistic approach and to develop policies and enabling legislation, et cetera, that might actually tend to take care of more than one of these closures related to either oil and gas or coal mining. And we look at some of the history of UK, and we see that, you know, there was UK, there were coal mine closures, then there was the oil and gas beginning to be really developed and offshore. And now we're starting to see some retreat from that. And we see this in other places. So my question is, what can we do with the feedback loop that we get and have this opportunity for constant improvement? And is there a way between enabling legislation and regulations and development of things like special purpose entities to be able to be more comprehensive and more flexible as we see these transitions take place? Because my idea here is ultimately we're not very good at predicting the next disaster. We've seen these kinds of things happen. At times, you know, you look around in the news, we have an earthquake, a fire, a volcano, a pandemic, and then we have the energy transition, and we're sort of left with a lot of issues that we have to deal with at once. So anyway, I'll open that up to the panelists for any kind of comments. Yes, yes, Professor Heffron.
Yes, so to briefly answer your question, I think in terms of legislation, in terms of regulation, in terms of special, let's say, special purpose units or vehicles, I think we need to try it all. I think as you know, as was stated by Michael, you know, what we need is the just transition working alongside the energy transition, and the two, let's say, go, you know, they go hand in hand. And I think when we think of the energy transition, we think of the need for some acceleration for those energy and climate targets of the Paris Agreement for 2030 and beyond. And I think we need to try a whole suite of legislation, and as it were, and we need to see what sticks. And I think we'd need to see all the avenues of legislation and regulation and different policy units that could be created, and essentially see what works in different places. What, you know, over the years. Again, as Michael said, this is not going to go away after 10 years. This is a 10 to 20 to 30 year project. And just as you mentioned yourself there, you know, when we think of the UK, we think of coal, and now we're thinking of oil and gas. So, I mean, you know, this is a 30 to 50 year project when you factor in coal and then some oil and gas aspects as well. So I think you know, you would need to sit down and see all the avenues for possible solutions, and then see what sticks. And I think it's time, let's say, to take more risks. Not every piece of legislation, regulation, not every policy unit has to be a success, in my view. I think we have to take more risks and see what works.
Yes, thank you very much for that reply. I think it is true that we need to not only use every tool in the toolbox that we have, but start looking at how we can invent some tools that may have some greater application. I see that we have a flag up from Norway at this point, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for a very interesting debate and contributions from the panelists. I particularly enjoyed the presentation on the cultural aspects, which is often forgotten. And I think that is a key actually to a good transition process. It's clear that the local communities, when they close down mines, etc., will be most difficult affected. But I would like to raise another issue, more global for the nation or even the regions affected. Coal has traditionally been the lowest cost of energy. When you take out that part of the energy production and energy supply, energy costs tend to go up. And as we know, energy is input to industrial processes, industrial goods and services. And that affects not only the local community, but the whole nation. And how do we address that? It will increase price on fertilizer production, food prices probably will go up, living costs in general will go up. How do we address that aspect? We have seen in the past, uprising of small tax increases, in yellow vests in France, for instance, seen the same in other countries. That is another important part of the debate. Living costs will increase, at least in the medium-term phase. We may see that the energy cost from renewable will decline in the future, but it will be very hard to compete with low-cost oil and gas and coal. So I would like to have some considerations around that global aspect. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have two other hands up at this point, and I'm certain that someone will touch back on some of those points that you raised, which are obviously valid. I'll call on the director of the Sustainable Energy Division, Mr. Scott Foster.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of observations. There is the activities done with the Secretary General's special envoy that we heard yesterday. And he went through the 5-point program that's being discussed for the extractive industries. And they talk about the socioeconomic environmental contract and the rest of that proposition, the 5-point plan that's proposed. What Mr. Stanley has said and what other speakers on the panel have said, I find quite interesting, is that when you start to undertake the activities for extractives, you need to already plan the other end so that you're looking at through the full life cycle with the repurposes once you've stopped the activities. So I would find the links between this group and that activity could be of interest. In particular, we're talking about coal mines largely, but there are lots of examples from all the extractive industries in the history, gold and tin and silver mines, where the transitions have just been handled badly. So I think there's a generalization of lessons learned from other industries that could be applied here and vice versa, so that you have that thinking through engagement with communities for a life cycle operation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the next hand up was Dr. Stanley, but the hand went down. Michael, do you still have something that you? Yeah, no, he's there, but.
I was going to respond to a couple comments that were made. The first is to the colleague from Norway. Actually, this is a very key issue, that many governments are reticent to take the decision to close coal, partly because of the power sector, but because of the broad distributed impacts that coal has in the economy, in the steel industry, heat industries, elsewhere. And so one of the things that we've been doing is general equilibrium modeling to inform governments of where all these impacts fall, and then to have a very broad holistic approach to match to that, to make sure that, that we are not just focusing narrowly on the disruption in coal production, but rather looking at all those end use sectors. So that was one point. And then the second point I was going to make to Mr. Foster was, indeed, there's a lot that can be learned, and we are learning from fishing industry. There are many industries that the cod industry is what I was thinking. Many industries that we've looked at, and so we're trying to distill those lessons learned and share them. And then the last point I was going to raise was that the best way to do this is to learn from one another. So I want to credit the European Commission, who started the Coal Regions in Transitions platform, so that one coal region could talk to another. And that has proven to be one of the best catalysts for decisions to be made, confidence to be built, and decisions to go forward, for governments to go forward, and communities and workers and enterprises to go forward. So those were just 3 quick points I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you for those points. And we have online one of the vice chairs of the Bureau for the group of experts on coal mine methane and just transition, Mr. Sergei Shumkov. Sergei? And before we do that, I don't know how Michael and Raphael and Bobby, if they want, get to the translation on this.
There is a translation.
Okay, sorry. Okay, okay. Mr. Shumkov.
Да, добрый день, уважаемые друзья. Рад вас всех видеть и слышать. Очень актуальная тема. Я бы коротко хотел остановиться о том, подчеркнуть, что закрытие шахт – это не самоцель. Важно найти сбалансированные источники энергии, которые позволят обеспечивать людей доступной экологически чистой энергией. Второе. Мы долгое время занимались чистыми угольными технологиями. Эта проблема еще до конца не исчерпана. И потенциал технологии, так называемой Zero Emission, очень высокий. Об этом тоже нужно помнить. И третье, о чем бы я хотел сказать, что закрытие шахт это не должно создавать какую-то панику. Огромный опыт в мире накоплен. Франция, Германия, Англия. В России мы закрыли более 200 шахт. Имеют опыт решения и социальных проблем, и экологических, и технических. Надо только подчеркнуть, что закрыть полностью шахту невозможно. Необходимо осуществлять постоянный мониторинг. Там возникает проблема подтопления, газа и так далее. Но это уже технические детали. Главное, что такой опыт есть. И кроме того, Рэй, я пересылал вам как-то копии документов в марте месяце в рамках ООН, в рамках межправительственного горного форума мы разрабатывали такие нормативные документы по закрытию горных предприятий. Стратегия, руководство, методические документы и в том числе наилучшие практики по закрытию шахт. Я считаю, что было бы очень полезно распространить эти документы среди участников и тех, кто заинтересован. И попросить, может быть, об этом господина Фостера. Я копии этих документов перешлю вам. Спасибо.
Thank you very much for those comments, Mr. Shumkov. And I think we should circulate those and circulate the documents. Perhaps we can send them again just to make certain that we have the ones that all of the ones that you're listing or thinking about. Also, the global standards that have been developed with the World Bank related to coal mine closures. We also are developing a strategy for circulating those as well for comments and input. So I think you're absolutely correct. We need to be drawing on historical successes. I also mentioned another historical success that related to the special purpose entities. The Coal Authority in the UK was developed to do some of the things that need to be taken care of through time, which is that once sites have been restored, sometimes hazards or other kinds of environmental issues reveal themselves through the years. And there needs to be a backstop for doing something about that. And there have been a couple of recent examples in the UK where there have been subsidence issues around dwellings and residences of apartments. And the Coal Authority was able to come in, essentially purchase that damaged site, fix the subsidence issues, move the dwellings to a safer spot, and essentially restart that community, or not community, but places for people to live. We've got 7 more minutes, and we have then a hard stop because at 1 o'clock the interpreters need to take a break. And so I just want to make certain that we have opportunity for anyone else. I see, oh yes, at the back. Yes, go ahead, Charlotte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Charlotte Griffiths from the Secretariat. I just want to congratulate the panel. I think this was a really good discussion, and it's really highlighted that there are a wide range of issues that are already have been undertaken and lessons that we can learn from. I wanted to flag that the ILO, a number of years back, they did produce guidelines and guiding principles related to just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. And I know that the group of experts on CMM has good cooperation with the ILO, so it might be worthwhile reaching out to them and seeing how you can build on that work. And I also just want to support the director in encouraging you and your group to reach out to the expert group on resource management. So for example, in some of the pilot studies that we've undertaken, you know, Michael Stanley flagged lessons we can learn from the fishing industries, et cetera. And that's exactly what happened with the pilot study we did in Mexico, which really impacted the fishing industries. So I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment, or those comments, Ms. Griffiths. And I see the Russian Federation has their flag up, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Well, it was indeed a really interesting discussion, and having heard to the points expressed by the speakers, we would have some observations regarding the respective items in the outcome report, because having heard like the scale of the problem and the number of areas it touches upon, I believe it won't be fair to frame it only by the mandate and within the scope of one expert group. So I would expand on these ideas when we approach the text of the outcome report, but basically the idea, I'll just flag it now, would be, well, I won't dwell onto the change of name of the group of experts, since I think it's already a decision which has been discussed by the group of experts. But the idea behind the proposals which we are going to make would be just to leave this section as a kind of like a general one, addressing the concept of just transition, saying the role of the just transition in the overall like energy management, and keep the reference to the group to the later part of the report, which is item 73. So I'm just also suggesting the Secretariat to consider like this section of the report in conjunction with item 73 of the report. Thank you.
Okay, but before we move to Bobby Foote, who has one more comment, I want to point out that when we had the discussion within our group of experts, we actually discussed for a long time the concept of changing the name to coal mine methane energy transition, but it was the Russian Federation that actually
recommended that it should be just transition and not energy transition, because various member states have already engaged in their own approach to energy transition and continue to do so. So I want to assure you that it's not our intention to impinge or direct or involve ourselves in that sort of discussion, but actually concern more about what happens as, in this case, mines close, and what happens with the repurposing, et cetera, if we don't address some of the issues that are relevant and relative to our group of experts. Yes, sir.
Yeah, one short comment. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think the just transition is exactly the term we need. Thank you.
Okay, and so I'd like to call on Bobby Foote, please. She has some other comments.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to support comments made by others about working with other sectors and learning from other commodities, and in particular going beyond mining with some of that. In some cases, there are actually some opportunities to work together on solutions that actually work for both groups. So, for example, there's some work being undertaken within Australia around feeding seaweed supplements to cattle to reduce methane emissions from cattle and other livestock. Coal mines, one of the closure issues can be water sources that are particularly saline. And so there's an opportunity there where we can actually use that as a post-mining land use that can actually help another industry to be more sustainable. So sometimes there are some really neat synergies that we could be working on together. So yes, we want to learn from the lessons of the past, but sometimes what are those partnerships and opportunities there that we could be looking at as well.
Sorry. Yes.
If I may, and I know that we're getting late, but I also would like to make one short comment at the end, and I of course support this broad approach, and this is also what I was trying to say before, but I also would like to add a word of caution that we should not rush. And I know that we heard from the panelists, and I agree with this, that we should have done it yesterday and it's already late. But at the same time, we still need to develop the strategy, and it's better to spend some time on developing strategies than jumping on implementing a bad strategy, or to work without any strategy. So unless we adopt a really holistic approach, we not be able to achieve a strategic change for those regions. And as much as it might be tempting to start implementing different projects that are appearing here and there, without a broad strategy, they would stay like projects in silos without really adding up to a broad strategy. And we should not forget that this is really what we try to achieve, is to reconfigure the regions and change their profiles. So yeah, just what I wanted to say is that I know that we pressed by time. I know that we already late with the transition, but at the same time, let's not rush without thinking to what's out there, and spend some time on actually good planning. Thank you.
Well, I want to take the opportunity to thank everyone. It was, in my opinion, a great opportunity to hear from experts really across the world as we discussed. And I really appreciate the interventions from the floor as well. They were all important comments and something for us to keep in mind. And with that, I want to thank everyone here and online, and we'll close this session and reconvene at 3 p.m. Geneva time. Thank you.